My husband laughed when the judge asked about my finances. He had just filed for divorce, demanded half our assets, and told everyone I would leave the marriage with almost nothing. Then the judge opened a sealed folder. "Mr. Carter," she said, "your wife inherited $28.7 million. His smile vanished. He turned toward me like he was seeing a stranger. For the first time, I smiled. He had spent months planning how to divide our life, never realizing there was one fortune he couldn't touch. But that wasn't the only secret I'd kept from him. The next question from the judge changed everything. The first time my husband laughed during our divorce, I knew I had made the right decision by saying nothing. We were sitting outside the courtroom, surrounded by lawyers, folders, and the cold silence of people pretending they weren't watching us. Daniel glanced at the settlement proposal and laughed. "You're serious?" he asked. His attorney smiled. Daniel looked directly at me. "You actually think you're walking away with half?" I didn't answer, because Daniel believed he knew everything about our finances. He believed the house was our biggest asset. He believed our investments were modest. And he believed I was the same woman who had spent 15 years trusting him with every important decision. He was wrong. But he wouldn't learn how wrong he was until the judge opened a sealed folder. Our marriage hadn't always been like this. When I met Daniel, he was charming, ambitious, and attentive. He remembered tiny things I said. He brought coffee to my office when I worked late and left handwritten notes beside my laptop. We married after 2 years, bought a quiet house, and built what I thought was an ordinary, comfortable life. I worked as a financial analyst. Daniel ran a construction company that had grown steadily. We weren't spectacularly wealthy, but we were comfortable. Then he changed. Daniel began staying late at work. His phone was suddenly always face down. Passwords changed. Conversations about money became defensive. Whenever I asked about the business, he'd say, "Fine. You don't need to worry about it." I heard that sentence when I asked about a new account. I heard it when a bank statement arrived that I hadn't seen before. Eventually, I heard it when I asked why he'd started talking to a divorce attorney. He didn't deny it. He simply smiled. "Maybe we're better off going our separate ways." I stared at him across our kitchen table. "Are you serious?" "Completely." Then he said something that hurt more than the divorce itself. "You'll be fine. You have your job. I'll take care of the important assets." The important assets. I should have challenged him. Instead, I asked, "What does that mean?" He shrugged. "I'll handle the business. The house can be dealt with later. We don't need to make this ugly." But he wasn't sad. He was relieved, almost excited. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel became increasingly confident. He hired an expensive divorce attorney and acted like the case was already decided. He told his brother that I'd never managed money properly. He told a friend the house would probably be his. One evening, while packing a suitcase, he said, "You should cooperate. Fighting me will only cost you more." I looked at him. "Cost me what?" He laughed. "Everything we've built." He didn't know that I'd already started protecting myself months earlier. It happened after my grandmother died. She had always been private about money. She lived modestly, drove the same old sedan for years, and never talked about what she owned. After her funeral, her attorney contacted me. I expected paperwork. Instead, I got a private meeting, a locked folder, and the words, "Your grandmother made very specific arrangements for you." I didn't tell Daniel. Not when the documents arrived. Not when the estate attorney explained that certain assets had been placed into a separate structure. And certainly not when I learned the total value. $28.7 million. But money wasn't the reason I stayed quiet. By then, I'd started noticing Daniel's questions. He asked whether I'd inherited anything. He asked whether the money was accessible. He asked what my grandmother's attorney had told me. I told him only that the estate was complicated and the lawyers were handling it. He accepted the answer. Or pretended to. Then came the day he filed for divorce. His attorney demanded complete financial disclosure. Daniel expected me to panic. Instead, I calmly signed the documents and handed them back. He looked almost disappointed. "That's it. That's it." He smiled. "Good. Then this should be easy." My attorney, Rebecca, waited until Daniel left before looking at me. Let him believe that. She opened a black folder. Inside were estate records, trust documents, transfer statements, and letters from my grandmother's attorney. Everything was dated. Everything was traceable. Everything established where the inheritance came from and when it became mine. Rebecca tapped the folder. Tomorrow, she said, your husband is going to learn the difference between what he thinks you own and what you actually own. That night, Daniel called from his hotel. He sounded cheerful. Almost done, he said. You'll see. This will be painless. I looked at the black folder beside me. Painless, I repeated. Exactly. He laughed. I didn't. Because for the first time since our marriage began, I knew something Daniel didn't. And tomorrow, in front of a judge, that secret was going to change everything. My grandmother had never looked like someone who could leave behind a fortune. That was the first thing I remembered when I sat across from her estate attorney. She had lived in the same small house for nearly 40 years. She clipped coupons, planted tomatoes in her backyard, and complained whenever someone spent too much money on dinner. But behind that quiet life was something I never fully understood. She had owned investments, property, shares in several companies. And over decades, those assets had grown into something enormous. I had never asked how much she was worth because she never talked about money. Then, after her funeral, her attorney slid a folder across his desk. Your grandmother wanted you to have this privately, he said. I opened the first document. Then another. Then another. My hands started shaking. I looked at him. How much? He took a breath. Approximately $28.7 million, based on the current valuation. I couldn't speak. $28.7 million. It didn't feel real. It felt like someone had accidentally handed me somebody else's life. But my grandmother had planned everything carefully. The inheritance wasn't simply deposited into our joint checking account. It had been transferred through a separate trust structure, with documentation showing exactly when and how the assets became mine. Her attorney explained every detail. Your grandmother was very deliberate, he said. She wanted this protected. Protected from what? He looked at me for a moment. Anyone who might eventually claim it. That sentence stayed with me. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was grieving. Daniel was supportive during the funeral, or at least he appeared to be. But a few weeks later, his questions started. What exactly did your grandmother leave you? I looked up from my coffee. I don't know yet. The lawyers are still handling everything.
Come on.
She had to leave something. Probably some property. Anything substantial? I smiled. Daniel, I honestly don't know. That was the first lie I ever told my husband. Except it wasn't really a lie. I knew there was money. I just didn't tell him how much. And after the way he'd begun acting, I didn't regret keeping it private. Then his questions became more specific. Did you sign anything? Are there accounts? Can you access them? Did her attorney say whether it's considered marital property? That last question made me look at him. Why are you asking about that? He immediately smiled. Because we're married. I'm just curious. But I wasn't convinced. Months passed. Daniel became more distant. And eventually he filed for divorce. The irony was almost unbelievable. He had spent months trying to find out what my grandmother left me. Then he filed for divorce without knowing the answer. Now we were sitting in the middle of a legal battle, and Daniel believed he had discovered the complete picture of our finances. His attorney had reviewed our joint accounts, our house, our investments, our retirement accounts, and everything else connected to our marriage. But the inheritance wasn't there, because it had never been mixed with our marital finances. The day before the hearing, Daniel called me. I hope you're ready to be reasonable. I was sitting at my attorney's office. What does reasonable mean to you? It means we divide what we have and move on. You already decided what I deserve. No, he said, laughing softly. I'm just being realistic. I didn't respond. He continued. You know, you don't have enough to make this worth fighting over. I looked at Rebecca. She was sitting across from me, quietly organizing documents. Then Daniel said, You're going to regret making this difficult. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, Good night, Daniel. I hung up. Rebecca looked at me. He still doesn't know.
No.
Are you sure you want the judge to be the one who tells him? I nodded. Yes. The next morning, we walked into court. Daniel arrived with his attorney, wearing an expensive suit and the same confident expression he'd been wearing since the divorce began. He looked at me and smiled. Then he laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly, like he'd already won. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Daniel nodded. The judge entered. Everyone stood. When we sat down, Daniel's attorney began explaining his client's position. He described our assets, the house, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, the savings. Then he made a statement that nearly made me smile. Based on the financial disclosures, Your Honor, my client believes the proposed division is straightforward. Straightforward. Daniel looked over at me. He was still smiling. Then Rebecca stood. Your Honor, there is one significant asset missing from that calculation. Daniel's expression changed. His attorney turned toward her. The judge looked at Rebecca. What asset? Rebecca opened the black folder. An inheritance received by my client from her late grandmother. Daniel frowned. That's not relevant. The judge looked at him. Mr. Carter, I'll determine what's relevant. Daniel leaned back. He still looked confident. Then Rebecca placed the first document on the table. The inheritance was valued at approximately $28.7 million. The room went silent. Daniel stopped moving. For several seconds, he simply stared at Rebecca. Then he looked at me. $28.7 million. I watched the confidence drain from his face. But he still wasn't ready to accept it. That's impossible, he whispered. The judge looked toward him. Mr. Carter, did you know your wife inherited $28.7 million? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time since he'd filed for divorce, he wasn't laughing. And I realized something. He hadn't been confident because he knew the truth. He had been confident because he thought he knew everything. Now the judge had the documents. And Daniel was about to discover exactly how expensive his assumptions had become. Daniel stared at Rebecca as if she had just spoken another language. $28.7 million? His voice was barely audible. The judge looked down at the documents in front of him. Mr. Carter, your attorney will have an opportunity to respond. For now, please let counsel proceed. Daniel sank back into his chair. 5 minutes earlier, he had been smiling. Now, he couldn't even look at me. Rebecca calmly explained the inheritance. She showed the court the estate documents, the trust records, the transfer dates, and the financial statements establishing that the assets came directly from my grandmother. Nothing had been deposited into our joint accounts. Nothing had been used to purchase our marital home. Nothing had been mixed with Daniel's business finances. The documentation was clean. The judge reviewed each page carefully. Then he asked Daniel's attorney, "Do you dispute the authenticity of these documents?" The attorney hesitated. "No, Your Honor." "Do you dispute the source of the funds?" Another pause.
No.
The judge nodded. Daniel finally leaned toward his attorney. "What does that mean?" His attorney whispered something I couldn't hear, but I understood Daniel's expression. He was beginning to realize that the money he'd imagined dividing wasn't necessarily available to him simply because we'd been married. The judge explained that the court would determine which assets were marital and which were separate according to the applicable law and the evidence presented. Daniel wasn't satisfied. "But we were married when she received it," he said. The judge looked at him. "Marriage alone does not answer every property question, Mr. Carter. The documentation matters." Daniel went silent. Then his attorney asked for a short recess. The judge agreed. As we stepped into the hallway, Daniel approached me. His voice had completely changed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him. "You asked. I didn't know it was that much." "That was the point."
He stared at me.
"We could have used it to build a life." I almost laughed. "A life?" "Yes. You filed for divorce." "I didn't know about the inheritance." "Exactly." He lowered his voice. "Listen, we don't have to destroy each other." I looked at him for several seconds. "You thought you were entitled to money you didn't even know existed." "That's not what I meant." "It is what you meant." He shook his head. "I made mistakes." "You made a decision." His face tightened.
People change their minds.
Not after they file. The recess ended. We returned to the courtroom. But something else had changed. Daniel's attorney no longer looked confident. Rebecca presented additional financial records showing that Daniel had previously described certain assets differently during the divorce process. The judge asked several questions. Daniel's answers became increasingly uncertain. Then Rebecca produced a document showing that Daniel had already created a personal budget based on receiving a large portion of the marital assets. He had calculated what he would buy. He had researched another property. He had even discussed financing a new business venture. He had planned his life around money he assumed he would receive. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Carter, is this your financial projection?" Daniel swallowed. "Yes." "And the anticipated funds listed here, where did you expect them to come from?" He didn't answer. His attorney finally said, "Your Honor, those were preliminary projections." Rebecca shook her head. "They were prepared before my client disclosed the inheritance." The judge nodded slowly. I watched Daniel's shoulders drop. The man who had laughed outside the courtroom now looked exhausted. Then he turned toward me. "I still love you." Those words should have hurt. Instead, they sounded strangely empty. I remembered the kitchen table. His smile. His words. "You'll be fine. I'll take care of the important assets." I finally understood what he had meant. He hadn't been planning our future. He had been calculating his exit. I looked at him. "You don't love me because you found out about the inheritance." His face went pale. "That isn't true." "Then why did everything change when you learned about the money?" He had no answer. The judge eventually issued the court's rulings regarding the assets before him, based on the documentation and applicable law. The inheritance remained treated according to its legal status, while the marital assets were divided according to the court's determination. Daniel didn't walk away with what he had expected. He kept certain property and assets, but the enormous fortune he'd imagined sharing was not suddenly his. The divorce was finalized. When I walked out of the courthouse, Daniel followed several steps behind me. "Wait." I stopped. He approached slowly. "I made a mistake." I looked at him. "Yes, you did. Can we talk? We've talked for months. Just give me another chance." I shook my head. "You already had one." Then I walked away. I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. For months, I'd been afraid that Daniel's decision would destroy my life. Instead, it showed me something I had forgotten. My life wasn't something another person could take from me. The inheritance helped me financially, of course. But the money wasn't my victory. My victory was finally understanding that I didn't need someone else to decide my worth. A few months later, I moved into a new home. I kept it simple. No enormous mansion. No extravagant cars. Just a quiet place with sunlight through the windows and enough room to breathe. I started volunteering with a local organization my grandmother had supported. I created an investment plan with her values in mind. And slowly, I started building a life that belonged entirely to me. Then, one evening, my phone showed a message from Daniel.
"Can we meet?"
I stared at it. Once, that message would have controlled my entire night. Now, I simply deleted it, because I finally understood something my grandmother had known long before I did. Money can protect your future, but it cannot repair a person who only values you when they discover what you own. Daniel filed for divorce believing he was taking my future from me. He never realized my future had already been mine. And this time, I wasn't going to hand it back.